Hey guys, I wanted to make a quick little video about this really cool new feature called the Vellum Minimal Solver that they released in Houdini 20.5. It flew a little bit under the radar, but I think that it deserves some attention, so I wanted to just make this little quick video to show you what I think about it and what it can do, and hope that it inspires some of you to give it a try. So let's check it out. So let's just make a new geo container so we can start from scratch, and we'll dive in, and maybe we'll make a sphere. I'll translate it up a bit, and then all we need to do is set a vellum configure grain node to set up our vellum grains. If we do that, we can then create points from volume, and that will create some grains. I have my ambient occlusion turned on in the settings, so you can actually get a little bit of interesting shading on there. Real quick though, I'm just gonna go back up to object level, and let's set the background to be dark by pressing D over the viewport and go to the background tab and hitting dark. So want to create a grid to be the ground plane. That we'll be able to cast shadows and stuff on, and then I'm going to turn on full lighting with shadows and just make some lights just to get a nice look. I love doing this now that we have the new viewport. You know, it won't run necessarily quite as fast, but it still is pretty snappy even when you have the stuff turned on. And I think that looks super nice. I'll even maybe give it like a hint of cool and warm colors on the left and right here. So this one will be more kind of reddish or yellowish. And yeah, I think this looks great. Cool. So we can dive back in to our Geo1 node. And in here, we have just like, super basic setup for some grains. And just like you normally would, you just type Vellum Solver, and you'll see we have this new thing called the Vellum Solver Minimal, which is actually just a regular Vellum Solver with some settings changed. Most importantly, it has this setting changed. Let's go back to frame one. At the top, where we can see the solver mode is set to minimal grains and fluid. Also, notably, the sub-steps are cranked up to 10, the smoothing iterations are completely turned off, and the constraint iterations are set to 10. And if we just hit play, this should work, except we don't have a ground plane, so I'll just turn that on real quick, and now we get some collisions, and it's very fast, although you would probably expect pretty similar speed to this from the regular Vellum Solver. So this starts really shining once we crank up the particle size a bit. We got a lot more particles here. Now this plays, again, really fast. If we go back to the full solver, we'll see it's going to be a lot slower than using that minimal mode. And that's because the minimal mode, it takes some shortcuts and it runs, I believe, completely on the GPU. Whereas Vellum is generally mostly just GPU accelerated by some OpenCL stuff. But with these kind of minimal modes, like with the Pyro mode, I believe the idea is that they're keeping more stuff on the GPU. And one thing that can be really slow is jumping back and forth between CPU and GPU, which is still necessary. I could be totally wrong about this, but I think it's something like that is the reason that it works so well. But because of that, it also isn't quite as fully featured. Just like a GPU renderer wouldn't necessarily be as fully featured as like a CPU renderer that's been around forever. Also, the self collisions are notably turned off down here. I don't know if they work or not on the Vellum Minimal Solver, but if we go to the Vellum Minimal Solver docs page on the Houdini 20.5 documentation, we can learn a lot about what the deal is with the solver and see this cool simulation animation render that Martin Winkler made. And you can see down here, we can read about what the Vellum Minimal Solver is a little bit. There's certain interesting caveats that we'll talk about in a minute, like the fact that it uses VDBs for collision. The Vellum Minimal Solver notably is the solver that has historically been used inside the Vellum brush, which we got a couple versions back. And now it's been sort of more fully featured so that we can use it specifically for doing things with fluid and grains, which is why if we go onto the solver, you'll see on that solver mode it says minimal and then in parentheses grains and fluid, because it's really meant specifically for just doing fast grain and fluid simulations. And you'll get some really cool examples of here this nice fluid simulation that's been done with it, as well as this nice kind of grain simulation that's done with it. And you'll also see these limitations down here. So the collision geometry must be prepared with a VDB collider SOP, which I think might be a new node. Also, changing constraint topology doesn't work, so breaking constraints, things like that, it needs to be the same constraint topology on every frame. The attached to geometry constraints and animated pin constraints don't work. And the built-in wind forces only work on grains and fluid. But you can still do standard sort of pop forces, geometry angles, things like that. But they only solve per frame. And it also notes down here, first splashes flip will produce better results than Vellum fluid. Now, in my opinion, the solver is a really great addition, because before, my take on Vellum fluid was it's not really worth using most of the time over flip, unless you really have to have bidirectional Vellum things that are affecting your fluids and vice versa. So like if you were doing, a simulation where you had like a bowl of soup with noodles and maybe some vegetables in there or something, and you want everything to kind of affect each other, the fluid to move the noodles around and the noodles to be affected by the fluid. But, just for like quick little fluid sims, I think it wasn't really any faster most of the time in my cases than flip. And in addition to that, it just also doesn't look nearly as good as flip usually. But now with the minimal mode, which is super, super fast, I think that it's pretty worth using for like really simple little fluid or grain simulations. So let's dive into some more settings and stuff now. If we go onto the advanced tab over here, you'll see that we have on the grain collision side, this repulsion weight and this attraction weight. If you turn the repulsion weight down, maybe all the way down, you'll see, oh, interesting. Okay, so now they're not really like just infinitely dispersing anymore. So that's kind of an interesting built-in thing that we have with Vellum grains. The attraction weight I find also to be really interesting, where if we crank that all the way up, you'll see we'll get some interesting kind of chunks together. Also, we can kind of mix these together, different amounts. I find having some attraction weight is really nice and will give you some really nice kind of clumping without you having to have glue constraints and stuff set up, which I find don't really work super well with the Vellum constraints, possibly because of that, with the Vellum minimal solve, possibly because of that topology note that we read about. Like maybe these glue constraints will, end up breaking or whatever. And that will change the topology of the constraints, and that will make the minimal solver upset. So you can get some weird, erratic kind of behavior with the minimal solver if you make it do stuff that it doesn't want to do. So again, that's why they're really trying to say just use this for fluid and grains, because it doesn't support all constraint types. But if you want to delve into some unknown territory and try other stuff, by all means. I mean, again, this thing was designed to work with the Vellum brush, so it should be able to theoretically do some basic cloth stuff and other things as well, although maybe you shouldn't expect cloth to be able to nicely interact with the fluid and grains and things like that in the minimal mode. For that, you're going to want to use the full vellum mode. So cool. All right, let's check this out some more. So if we go to the physical attributes on the grain, we can see we have friction, dynamic friction. They have this attraction weight and repulsion weight, which can be just viewed as attributes on here that you can kind of tweak per point in theory. I also like on here to make it so that it's not so uniform. So I will usually turn on the jitter scale, and then you'll get a little bit more of a random looking organization of the grains. Although you will notice that they then kind of, there's this weird thing where they kind of at the beginning push out, and that can be even more dramatic in certain situations. But if you adjust the radius to avoid overlap, now if we play it, you'll see they don't really pop out anymore. They just kind of fall, and also like start attracting to each other and things like that because of that attraction weight and stuff. So that's cool. That's all fun stuff. Now let's get some collisions going. So what I'll do is maybe I'll make a capybara over here. And we have that VDB collider node that we can plug the capybara into, and we can set the voxel size to be a bit lower, so maybe it's more accurate. Whoops. Yeah, let's try that for now. And I'll plug that into here, and it's going to be intersecting already, so maybe I can move this guy up a little bit and hit play. And now we got the collisions happening with the capybara. So that's pretty fun. What about the vellum fluid stuff? So if we want to try that instead, what we could do is bypass this and instead set up a vellum configure fluid. And I'll plug this in here and once again set that particle scale low. Maybe that's too low. And also I've noticed a weird bug where it's not displaying properly in the Vulkan viewport in the solver, but if we make a null after the solver, then it ends up displaying fine. Super weird, something to be aware of. I definitely need to report that to side effects. Template flag this guy so that we can see it in the collision, and then I'll hit play, and it still is like pretty remarkably fast for the amount of grains that we have going here. And especially when you consider also like this fancy kind of viewport shading that we have going on, or excuse me, this vellum fluid. And like that's definitely faster than flip, I think, even though the behavior is a lot more simple and not quite as, you know, interesting. But something like this, where we have, you know, 500,000 particles, we could probably get away with less particles, and this kind of thing would make me now consider much more easily simulating like, you know, water in a glass that someone's holding, which maybe I would have wanted to fake before because it would be too annoying to do with a flip sim or whatever if it's not, you know, a big kind of like hero object or something. So just something to keep in mind in terms of like the ways that you might want to consider using this. I want to highlight a few other interesting settings for vellum fluid specifically. If we go into the vellum solver and we go to, again, that advanced tab, over here, you'll see that there's a few things. One is adhesion, which we can set to 1. And another one is collision viscosity, which will change the viscosity on collision. So we can set that to like something like 100. And this is if we want to get our fluids to feel kind of sticky and like stick to the objects that it's colliding with. Also on the VDB collider, there is something called sticky, which is a multiplier on that adhesion. So if we have adhesion and we set that to something like, I don't know, 2 or let's say 5. We'll sort of see how this works out. And I'll play through this, and we'll see on the Vellum Minimal Solver, still, again, with like roughly 500,000 points, it's simming this stuff as fluid, and it's getting something like 2 FPS, which I think is pretty great, and is just like so much faster than what you would get on the regular old Vellum Solver. And now we're getting this really nice kind of drippy effect on our capybara character, and we can play it back, and it just looks really nice all in the viewport now, playing back at real time. Some really cool kind of behavior. Again, it's not that same level that you'd get with Flip, but for the speed, it's pretty amazing, and it will make me kind of consider doing fluid sims for stuff that I maybe would have wanted to try to cheat without doing fluid sims for before. So I think that's a really good way to kind of think of this. I'm going to use one of my favorite newer nodes called Merge Packed to, instead of template flagging the geo, just visualize it together with the grains. And we'll see, yeah, there. Now we got this really nice looking setup. And the Merge Packed, I just find, kind of helps keep things separated more and let you deal kind of with having like multiple, like what would normally be different objects within one SOP graph. It packs them, and you can always unpack them and split them up and do whatever and re-merge pack them. But I found that performance is also a lot better this way than if you just use a regular merge, which I made a quick tip about a while ago. So cool. Another thing you could do is, to mesh this stuff, just like with Flip, you could use particle fluid surface. But also, if you wanted to just visualize the sort of speed of this stuff like you do by default in Flip, you could, instead of using this to surface the particles, just use it to visualize the particles and set that visualize to velocity. And now we'll see they'll kind of get brighter as they move faster. We can change this velocity range if we want. And now we'll get some kind of interesting behavior here that looks nice. Now, if we wanted to actually mesh this with the particle fluid surface, it's slightly tricky, but we can definitely figure it out. So if we go into the Convert To tab and change that back to Surface Polygon Soup, it will give us a sort of meshing out the gate if we set that particle separation, because it's using average position. Now, this is okay, and you can use average position. If you're going to do that, you got to make sure you check on this box that says limit refinement iterations, because that will prevent it from like popping a bunch, like holes popping and closing on the surface and flickering on the mesh, which I know a lot of people run into since they kind of just use the default settings from this when they are first trying to figure out how to mesh fluids. I personally, though, tend to like to turn the adaptivity off, which you'll see is going to make it so that it doesn't try to reduce the polygon count. And I like to use this spherical meshing mode, which relies on the p-scale. And if we check the p-scale of our points, we'll see that it's set to 0.05. And that is being created by the Vellum configure grain, or rather Vellum configure fluid node, based on that particle size. So it's basically saying, okay, the particle size is 0.01, so the p-scale is going to be half of that. So that makes sense. However, the particle fluid surface is designed to work with Flip, and Flip is a little bit different, where if we set the particle separation to that same value of 0.01, what it's going to do is actually create the p-scale inside the solver, and that is set to, for some reason, 0.012. So rather than being multiplied by half, it's being multiplied by 1.2. So what we can do is just create a point wrangle in here, and we can say f at p-scale times equals 2, and then also say f at p scale times equals 1.2. And that should give us the same value if we go and check our p scale. Now we have 0.012. And if we set that particle separation the same as what it is up here, or rather copy the parameter and paste the relative reference, now it'll correctly mesh our fluids, and it'll look okay. It'll look pretty detailed. We can actually go into that filter tab, and what I tend to like to do is turn all the smoothing stuff on, but then reduce it a little bit. So I usually set it to 1111 instead of 2222. And then that gives me something that I'm pretty happy with usually. You can play with this stuff more, but I tend to like to kind of leave this stuff around these settings when I'm doing flip. One last thing that I want to show is, and I'll just plug this back into the Vellum solver output so we can just see what it looks like with the collision geo, is the fact that we can actually use the minimal solver for fluid that is emitting per frame as well. Even though the Vellum minimal solver doesn't like changing constraint topology, that doesn't mean that we can't emit more fluids and grains. Thankfully, fluids and grains don't really use a lot of constraints, or rather any constraints. If we go over and look at the constraints themselves, they're literally just points with the position. So it's the exact same thing, basically, that we're feeding in as the geo, just without all the other attributes and stuff. So if we want to set up emission, what I might want to do is make the sphere a lot smaller, and we're going to kind of give the capybara a shower, I think. So we'll do that, and then now this lives up here. That can be sort of where the fluid's emitting from. I think another thing that I want to do is change the seed of that jitter scale every frame so it doesn't look super consistent. And then what we can do is just dive into the Vellum solver. We can do a Vellum source, plug this into the source tab, and then we should just make a null here that is called geo, and a null here that's called constraints. And then we jump back in the Vellum solver, go in here, and then for the SOP path, we're going to go into our geo1 and grab the geo. I'll put that in for the target path as well. And then for the constraints, just got to point it to the constraints, tell it to emit every frame. And now if we hit play, we should get some emission every frame. And again, we're having an issue visualizing it on the solver itself, but cool. That looks like that is in fact working. That's pretty fun. So there's this weird kind of burst that it has in the beginning, and that's because it's sourcing this stuff in on the first frame here, like it does normally. And then this Vellum source is also sourcing stuff in on the first frame. So what we could do is we could say, let's set the activation of this to when $F is greater than 1. And hopefully that should fix it. Yeah, it looks to be a bit better now. So cool. And now we can look at this and see we got some emitting fluid. I think it would also be fun, though, if we could make it so that our character was moving in some way. Now, there's two different things that we could do. One is if our character is deforming, it's going to be a bit slow because it's going to be slow to purely recalculate and re-import this VDB into DOPS every single frame. But we can set it to animated deforming, and I can do a bone deform to animate our Cappy character, and we can plug this into here, and we'll see, again, if I play it on here, you know, this is already going to be playing at 7 FPS or whatever. So that's a lot slower than if we're setting this to static, and then, you know, it's going to play at an insane speed because it doesn't have to recalculate every frame. So that is one thing that is going to slow down a sim like this quite a bit. So I'll hit play and give it a second to do this compiling OpenCL kernel stuff that it's going to have to do sometimes with the minimal solver. Cool, and now it's simming pretty quickly. And like I said, you know, this is one way that you can do sims with animated colliders, and, you know, it works totally fine. But also, if you're just transforming an object, for example, we can set it to animated rigid. And I can plug this back into here. I'll plug this guy back into here as well for good measure. And for some reason, it seems to have an issue with turning our Cappy into a SDF using this rigid setting. I don't have any idea why this could be. But if we just turn off this use input animation, then it seems to work fine. And then what we could do is just make it transform, where I will say, let's do rotate on $F times 5. And I will Control-Shift-Alt-Drag this transform node to make a reference copy, and just use that so that we can display it rotating in the merge pack down here. And so I'll jump into here and hit play. And awesome. Now we have this super fun animation of Cappy on a turntable taking a shower. And it's simulating super fast, mostly on my GPU, while I am also recording this stuff with OBS, so it could be even faster. Potentially. You can see my videos kind of lagging down here in the corner because, again, it's using up my GPU. But yeah, I think that there's, like I was saying, a ton of potential with this stuff, and I'm super excited about it. I think, again, it wasn't really mentioned much in that Houdini 20.5 keynote, just barely sort of touched on. So I wanted to highlight it, and I feel like it's, you know, it's probably not as big of a deal as something like the NPM solver. But I also think it is a much bigger deal than people make it out to be, because just having these different options, having the slower kind of NPM stuff that's super detail oriented versus like Vellum, which is kind of in the middle, and now this super fast option, it just opens up a lot of use cases of where you might consider using this stuff where you weren't going to think about using it before. And then you can make fun stuff like this really quick and easily. So yeah, thanks for watching. Try this stuff out. Let me know what you think. And I hope you are enjoying the new Houdini 20.5 release as much as I am.